I'm Wentao, and I'm going to be talking about the role of professional product reviewers in evaluating security and privacy. This is work that I did with Jason Walter and Michelle Mazurek at the University of Maryland. Okay, so as we know, internet-connected devices and software expose consumers to various harms, right? We've got personal risks from devices and software, as well as botnets, which actually pose risks to others as well. And so choosing safe products is important, but it's hard, right? It's kind of unreasonable to expect consumers who lack the time and resources and expertise to evaluate security and privacy on their own. So our kind of overarching question is this, right? How can professionals help consumers choose safe products when it comes to security and privacy? And we decided to kind of start with looking at product reviewers. And product reviewers are professionals who publish information to help consumers decide what products to use. They work at a variety of organizations, ranging from nonprofits to media websites and companies, as well as YouTube channels. And we're specifically looking at internet-connected devices and software, right? And so what we have in mind for this is smart home devices, such as connected cameras, wearables, such as fitness trackers, and software, such as, for example, tax filing services. All right, so to evaluate how product reviewers evaluate security and privacy for these kinds of devices and software, we conducted semi-structured interviews. And we focused on the following 4 questions. First, what security and privacy criteria do they evaluate? How do the incentives and assumptions that they have influence how they do so? What techniques and tools do they use? And then what are their challenges and needs? Our interviews took place over Zoom, so we conducted them virtually. They took about 48 minutes on average. Here are a couple example questions that we asked regarding what kinds of security and privacy-related criteria they look at and how that factors into their decisions. And then at the end of our interviews, we asked participants to complete a questionnaire that took about 4 minutes. And there we asked about security and privacy knowledge, as well as demographic and organizational information. So to go over some of that, we required participants to have published 10 reviews that were on internet-connected devices and software. We avoided mentioning security and privacy in this whole process until we were part of the way through the interview, because we wanted to see if it would come up on its own, whether people would bring it up before we mentioned it explicitly. And we got a decent spread of kind of experience from our participants. So there were people who were pretty new to it, as well as several people who had over 10 years of experience. And similarly, we had a good spread when it came to organization size, ranging from just independent reviewers all the way up to people who are working at organizations with 20 or more employees. I should say 20 or more product reviewer employees. So now I'm going to go over some of the themes from our interviews. These are just some of the most important findings, right? If you want more, there's much more in the paper, and I encourage you to read it. So firstly, we found that there are some incentives to evaluate security and privacy. One thing that some participants mentioned was reaching specific audiences. For example, one participant talked about starting to evaluate security and privacy in order to reach audiences who had young children and might have particular concerns. And one theme that really came up a lot was that protecting reputation is an important thing for reviewers to do. So as participant 8 said, I would hate to have a glowing review about a product, and then 2 weeks later they have a data breach because they didn't encrypt something, and that makes the product reviewer look bad. However, we were also not terribly surprised to learn that there are major disincentives to discuss security and privacy. So for one, negative reviews are just often unprofitable. A lot of reviewers have this business model where they need people to read the reviews and also potentially buy the products that they review in order to make money. And so that can kind of discourage discussing security and privacy issues, especially. And then audiences were often perceived as uninterested in security and privacy. So participant 11 said they had done videos on security vulnerabilities, but it doesn't get searched for, it doesn't get watched, people don't care about it. The good news is that the existence of major disincentives doesn't mean that there's no evaluation of security and privacy. Participant 6 told us that their organization always discusses two-factor authentication, as well as the location of data storage, and whether AI processing is done locally or on some server. However, that's the type of thing that we might not write in review, because most people shopping for these devices might not know what that means, and they might not be as interested. So this is promising, somewhat. So then you might be asking, how do they actually look at security and privacy? So we asked people, what are the criteria that you actually evaluate when you're looking at devices? And so here's a list. Rather than make you read through all of it, I'm going to highlight a couple points. First off, there was a lot of emphasis on prioritizing protection of user data. So by far the most common criteria that people talked about was just what data is collected and how it's shared and used. And then second and third were the reputation of the company and product, which often was about data breaches, and then the locale of data storage and processing. On the other hand, there was less emphasis on long-term security features. So things like software updates were only mentioned by a couple of reviewers of our participants. One person mentioned vulnerability disclosure programs, and audits never really came up. We also asked our participants about challenges in evaluating security and privacy. And so one of the ones that came up was just that limited time and expertise mean technical tools are often impractical. So even when reviewers are aware of tools like Wireshark and Syslog, these are just not really the right fit for the limitations that most reviewers face. And there's some techniques that are feasible, but are just kind of frustrating, right? So participant 6 told us that they look at privacy policies, right? Because it's it's a source of information about how the companies handled your data. But because they're long and they're jargony, it's just difficult, right? I remember my eyes glossing over a little bit during this kind of work. And so in the presence of these challenges, we found that participants really leaned on certain assumptions to kind of guide what they focused on. Some example assumptions that people brought up were that free or cheap devices inevitably have privacy trade-offs. They might not know what those trade-offs are. They might not have time to try and look into it and figure out exactly what it is, but they just kind of have this as a caveat in their mind when they're reviewing free or cheap devices, especially ones with free or cheap cloud storage. And then we also talked to some participants who focused specifically on HomeKit, which is a framework that Apple kind of runs. And several of these people told us that HomeKit devices are inherently trustworthy. Participant 3 said, with HomeKit, everything is inherently secure. Stuff runs local, there's no external server calls. And there were some other reasons that people gave as well, including, say, a more rigorous certification process that included security review. So to return to our central question of, what is the role of reviewers in evaluating security and privacy? We find that despite the disincentives, reviewers are technical professionals who currently provide important security and privacy advice to consumers, even if it is infrequent or skewed. They fill a crucial gap, right? Given the sheer quantity of internet-connected products, they arguably are the only people who are evaluating the security and privacy of popular products with really any regularity and timeliness. And they cover meaningful criteria, but important areas are left out. The kind of long-term security factors that I talked about earlier, we think some of those could be impactful and also not that hard to evaluate. All it could take is a brief check. Does it have a bug bounty program? Or does this product, what does the company say about security updates and how long they're going to support them? And they lean on these assumptions that allow them to incorporate consideration of security and privacy, which is great, but these assumptions may not be reliable, right? So that's something to to look into. And so I want to conclude by talking about how we can help reviewers help consumers. So first, outreach. In addition to sharing information directly with product review organizations, researchers should also ensure that important information finds its way to the news media. We observe that product reviewers are actually quite tuned into news about tech security and privacy. And so this could be advocating for easy and impactful criteria, as well as getting the word out on products that have kind of critical flaws. So as I mentioned earlier, reviewers are incentivized to avoid recommending products that might cause them reputational harm later. And in addition, getting out the word on individual products and brands could have a longer-term impact also, because reviewers paid a lot of attention to company reputation. There are examples where brands have a certain reputation for maybe poor security and privacy, for example, Ring and Eufy, and reviewers talk to us about kind of taking that into account in the reviews as caveats to the recommendations. And we also think that it's worth moving beyond kind of just evaluative tools, but also trying to create tools that are legitimately helpful to product reviewers. So a lot of these reviewers have pretty extensive setups in their homes. They have like tens, if not 100 IoT devices set up in their homes, and they want to protect themselves. A lot of them will have like a separate network set up so they don't expose their own home network to excessive risks. And so tools that help reviewers manage these devices, including security and privacy, could also help them spot issues for consumers. And then finally, we think that security and privacy labels could be really useful for reviewers and fit well with kind of the way that they work, right? They lean on these assumptions, but labels could help replace some of those assumptions that they make with actual informed facts. And as kind of a bonus, we think that reviewers could help play an important role in getting labels out to the public, right? They can help interpret labels for consumers and pass on that information. So thank you so much for your time, and I would love to hear any thoughts you have and take any questions.
Thank you, Wentao.